After delivery your useless child. Pack your stuffs and get out husband texted wife in labor. Distinguished viewers, welcome to Luxury True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more amazing real-life luxury stories. Now, let's get into the story. Naomi Patterson grew up in a quiet suburban town where life was simple but never easy. Raised by her widowed mother, Clara Patterson, she learned early that love was not spoken loudly. It was shown through sacrifice, patience, and quiet strength. Clara worked long hours as a seamstress, often coming home with tired eyes but a gentle smile that never failed to comfort Naomi. Their small home carried warmth despite its modest appearance, filled with the soft hum of late-night sewing and whispered prayers for a better tomorrow. Naomi, even as a child, understood that life would not hand her anything freely, but she never allowed hardship to make her bitter. She grew into a woman known for her kindness, intelligence, and calm resilience. Naomi had a way of seeing the good in people, even when it wasn't obvious. She studied hard, earned opportunities through persistence, and eventually found work as an assistant coordinator in a corporate events company. Though her job was demanding, she carried herself with grace, always believing she was building a future where she would one day have the loving family she had always dreamed of. To her, love was not about wealth or status, it was about loyalty, care, and standing beside someone even when life became difficult. Despite her hopeful nature, there was a quiet fear she never voiced, the fear of ending up alone, or worse, giving her heart to someone who would not value it. Still, Naomi chose to believe in love wholeheartedly. She believed that somewhere in the world was a man who would see her, cherish her, and build a life with her based on mutual respect and genuine affection. She didn't know it yet, but that belief would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Joshua Morgan was born into wealth, power, and expectation. The Morgan family name carried influence in corporate circles, and from a young age, Joshua was taught that success was not optional, it was a requirement. His father, Richard Morgan, was a strict and calculating businessman who believed emotions were weaknesses, while his mother, Diane Morgan, valued reputation above all else. Their home was grand, their lifestyle luxurious, but warmth was something that never truly existed within those walls. Joshua grew up learning how to win, how to dominate, and how to maintain control, but never how to love selflessly. As he grew older, Joshua became everything his family expected him to be: sharp, confident, and undeniably charismatic. He knew how to command attention in a room, how to speak with authority, and how to make people feel important when it suited him. Women were drawn to his confidence and status, and he moved through relationships effortlessly, never staying long enough to become emotionally invested. To Joshua, relationships were convenient additions to his life, not something that required vulnerability or sacrifice. Beneath his polished exterior, he feared losing control more than anything, and that fear shaped the way he treated people. Despite his success, there was an emptiness Joshua never acknowledged. He filled his life with work, luxury, and fleeting pleasures, convincing himself that this was enough. He believed that as long as he maintained power and control, nothing could threaten him. Love, in his eyes, was something people used to weaken others, a tool that could easily become a liability. He had no idea that soon, he would meet someone who would challenge that belief, not by force, but by simply being everything he never understood. The night Naomi Patterson met Joshua Morgan was one she had carefully prepared for, though she had no idea how significant it would become. The corporate charity gala she was coordinating was one of the biggest events her company had ever handled, and every detail had to be flawless. The ballroom shimmered with elegance, crystal chandeliers casting soft golden light, polished floors reflecting the movement of well-dressed guests, and the quiet sound of a live orchestra filling the air. Naomi moved through the crowd with purpose, ensuring everything ran smoothly, her calm presence masking the pressure she was under. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her natural grace standing out in a room filled with extravagance. Joshua Morgan arrived late, as he often did, making an entrance without even trying. Conversations shifted subtly as people noticed him, his presence commanding attention with effortless authority. He scanned the room out of habit, more out of boredom than interest, until his gaze landed on Naomi. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't seeking attention, yet there was something about her composure and quiet confidence that immediately caught his interest. Unlike everyone else in the room, she seemed grounded, untouched by the need to prove anything. For the first time that evening, Joshua felt curious. Their first interaction was brief but unexpected. Naomi approached him professionally, ensuring he was comfortable and had everything he needed as a guest. Joshua, used to rehearse politeness, was surprised by her sincerity. She spoke to him without pretense, her voice calm, her words thoughtful. Instead of the usual admiration he received, there was something different, respect, but not submission. That difference lingered in his mind long after she walked away. For Naomi, it was just another guest attended to, another task completed. For Joshua, it was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand, but would soon be unable to ignore. Joshua did not forget Naomi Patterson after that night. In fact, she became the one person he couldn't easily dismiss from his thoughts. The following day, he found himself asking around, subtly, of course, until he learned her name, her role, and where she worked. It was unlike him to be this interested, but something about her composure and quiet strength lingered in a way he couldn't explain. Within days, he arranged what appeared to be a coincidence, another event, another appearance, another chance to see her again. But this time, his attention was deliberate. Naomi was surprised when Joshua approached her again, this time not as a guest, but as someone seeking her attention. He spoke with charm and ease, his confidence undeniable, but there was a softness in his tone she hadn't noticed before. He asked her about herself, her work, her goals, her life beyond the event halls. Naomi, though cautious at first, found herself responding openly. There was something disarming about the way he focused on her, as though she were the only person that mattered in that moment. It wasn't long before their conversations extended beyond work, turning into dinners, long walks, and quiet moments filled with laughter. Their relationship moved quickly, almost effortlessly. Joshua introduced Naomi to a world she had never experienced. Fine dining, luxurious settings, spontaneous trips, while Naomi gave him something he didn't realize he lacked, emotional grounding. She listened, she cared, and she saw beyond his polished exterior. To Naomi, it felt like a dream unfolding exactly as she had always hoped. To Joshua, it felt like control slipping in a way that was both unfamiliar and strangely addictive. What neither of them fully realized was that beneath the beauty of their growing connection, there were cracks forming, small, almost invisible, but strong enough to change everything. As their relationship deepened, the excitement of new love slowly gave way to moments that were harder to ignore. At first, Joshua's attention felt like care. He wanted to know where Naomi was, who she was with, and what she was doing. He would call frequently, sometimes unexpectedly, just to check in. Naomi, who had always believed that love meant being present and involved, saw it as affection. She reassured him, adjusted her schedule, and made space for his constant need to stay connected. It didn't feel like control at first, it felt like importance. But over time, those small gestures began to change in tone. Joshua started questioning her decisions, subtly criticizing the people she surrounded herself with, especially her closest friend, Elena Brooks. He would make offhand comments about how certain friends weren't good for her, or how she deserved better company. When Naomi had late work hours or needed time alone, he became distant or cold, making her feel guilty without directly saying it. His words were never harsh enough to be called out, but they carried weight, enough to make Naomi second-guess herself. Naomi noticed the shifts, but she chose to interpret them through the lens of love. She believed Joshua was simply protective, that his behavior came from a place of care rather than control. Whenever doubt crept in, she silenced it with reassurance, reminding herself that no relationship was perfect. To her, love required patience and understanding, even when things felt slightly off. She didn't realize that these small moments were shaping something much larger, something that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Joshua chose to propose in a way that matched everything he valued: public, impressive, and impossible to ignore. The setting was another high-profile corporate gala, larger and more extravagant than the one where they first met. The room was filled with influential guests, soft music, and carefully arranged elegance. Naomi had no idea what was coming. She believed she was simply attending another event, dressed beautifully but focused, as always, on ensuring everything went smoothly. The night felt normal, until it suddenly wasn't. At the peak of the evening, Joshua took the stage. Conversations quieted instantly, all eyes turning toward him. His voice carried confidence as he spoke about success, ambition, and the importance of having someone who stands beside you. Naomi stood frozen in the crowd as his words slowly shifted, becoming personal, directed unmistakably toward her. When he called her name, the room seemed to disappear around her. He stepped down, walked toward her, and without hesitation, dropped to one knee. The moment was grand, perfectly timed, and filled with applause even before she responded. Naomi's heart raced as emotions overwhelmed her: surprise, joy, disbelief. This was everything she had once dreamed of, a moment that felt like confirmation that her faith in love had been right all along. She said yes, her voice soft but certain, as the room erupted into celebration. Joshua smiled, satisfied, not just by her acceptance, but by the perfection of the moment he had created. To Naomi, it was the beginning of forever. To Joshua, it was another achievement, beautiful, controlled, and exactly as he intended. Neither of them fully understood what that yes would eventually cost. The early days of Naomi and Joshua's marriage were filled with a quiet kind of happiness that felt almost unreal to Naomi. Their home was elegant, spacious, and carefully designed, everything she had once imagined a married life could be. Each morning, she woke up believing she had stepped into the future she had always hoped for. She tried to make the house feel warm, adding small personal touches, flowers by the window, soft music in the evenings, home-cooked meals whenever she could. To her, marriage wasn't just about sharing space. It was about building a life filled with comfort, care, and connection. Joshua, however, approached marriage differently. To him, little had changed except that Naomi was now officially part of his life. He continued his routine, long hours at work, constant business meetings, and a social calendar that rarely slowed down. At first, Naomi didn't mind. She understood his ambition and admired his dedication. But gradually, she began to notice that he made little effort to include her in that world. Invitations came, but often as an afterthought. Conversations became shorter, less meaningful. The warmth she tried to create at home wasn't always returned, and the space between them began to grow in subtle, almost unnoticeable ways. There were moments when Naomi tried to reach him, small attempts to reconnect, to talk, to share. Sometimes he responded, but often with distraction or impatience, as though emotional conversations were interruptions rather than necessities. When she expressed concern, he reassured her briefly, dismissing her worries with calm confidence. "Everything is fine," he would say, and she wanted to believe him. So she did. She told herself that marriage required adjustment, that love wasn't always loud or obvious. But deep inside, something had begun to shift, something quiet, but persistent, like a crack slowly forming beneath a surface that once seemed unbreakable. Sarah Benjamin reappeared in Joshua's life without warning, but not without intention. She was everything Naomi was not: bold, unapologetic, and dangerously confident. Sarah had a presence that demanded attention, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed but simply expected it. She had once been deeply involved with Joshua before Naomi came into the picture, and unlike others, she had never fully let go. To Sarah, relationships were not about emotional depth but influence, excitement, and power. She understood Joshua in a way that fed his ego, not challenged it. Their reunion happened at an exclusive business lounge, where Joshua had gone for a late meeting. He hadn't expected to see her there, but when their eyes met, the familiarity was instant. Sarah approached him with a knowing smile, as though no time had passed at all. Their conversation flowed easily, slipping into old patterns of teasing, confidence, and unspoken understanding. She spoke to him without restraint, reminding him, subtly, of the version of himself that existed before responsibility, before expectations, before Naomi. It stirred something in him, something he hadn't realized he missed. From that moment, Sarah became a quiet but growing presence in Joshua's life again. At first, it seemed harmless, occasional conversations, brief meetings framed as coincidences. But beneath that surface was something deeper, something intentional. Sarah knew exactly how to position herself, how to pull Joshua closer without forcing it. Meanwhile, Naomi remained unaware of the shift, continuing to hold onto the version of her marriage she believed in. What she didn't know was that a new dynamic had begun to form, one built not on love, but on temptation, ego, and choices that would soon reshape everything. What began as occasional meetings between Joshua and Sarah quickly evolved into something far more deliberate. Joshua started making time for her in ways he no longer did for Naomi. Lunch meetings stretched into late evenings, business discussions turned into personal conversations, and before long, their interactions carried a familiarity that blurred the boundaries he once claimed to respect. Sarah knew exactly how to keep him engaged. She laughed at his jokes, admired his decisions, and never questioned him. With her, there was no emotional demand, no need to explain himself. It was easy, effortless, and dangerously appealing. At home, Naomi began to feel the difference, though she couldn't fully explain it. Joshua was more distant than ever, often distracted even when physically present. His phone became something he guarded closely, his attention divided in ways that left her feeling invisible. Conversations between them became routine and shallow, stripped of the warmth that once defined their connection. Naomi found herself trying harder, planning dinners, initiating conversations, holding on to small moments in hopes of rekindling what they had. But each attempt felt like reaching for something that was slowly slipping away. Meanwhile, Joshua justified his actions in quiet, internal ways. He convinced himself that nothing was truly wrong, that he was simply reclaiming a part of himself he had set aside. Sarah represented freedom, freedom from expectations, from emotional responsibility, from the weight of being needed. He ignored the growing distance in his marriage, choosing instead to focus on what felt good in the moment. What he failed to see was that these small choices were no longer harmless. They were building towards something irreversible, something that would soon cross a line neither of them could step back from. Naomi discovered she was pregnant on a quiet morning that began like any other, but ended with a life-changing realization. The moment she saw the result, her hands trembled, not with fear, but with overwhelming emotion. A soft smile spread across her face as she sat in stillness, letting the reality settle in. This was the beginning of something new, something she had always dreamed of. In her mind, this child would bring warmth back into her marriage, a reason for Joshua to reconnect, to return to the love they once shared. It felt like hope, pure and powerful. She spent hours thinking about how to tell him, wanting the moment to be special. That evening, she prepared dinner herself, something she hadn't done in a while, carefully setting the table to create a calm and intimate atmosphere. When Joshua arrived, distracted as usual, she gently asked him to sit. There was a softness in her voice, a quiet excitement she couldn't hide. When she finally told him, she watched his face closely, searching for joy, surprise, anything that reflected what she felt. But what she saw instead was hesitation, followed by a reaction she couldn't quite understand. Joshua's response was not what she expected. He acknowledged the news, but without enthusiasm, without the warmth she had imagined. His words were measured, almost distant, as though he were processing something inconvenient rather than celebrating something meaningful. Naomi tried to brush it off, telling herself he was simply caught off guard. She held on to her happiness, refusing to let his reaction take that away from her. But deep down, a quiet unease began to grow. This child meant everything to her, but to Joshua, it seemed to mean something entirely different. As the days passed, Naomi held tightly to the joy of her pregnancy, nurturing it even in the absence of shared excitement. She began preparing quietly, reading, planning, imagining a future that felt brighter than her present. Every small milestone meant something to her: the first appointment, the first changes she noticed in her body, the growing awareness that she was no longer alone. She longed to share these moments with Joshua, to make him a part of something so meaningful, but each attempt was met with the same calm distance that had begun to define him. Joshua, on the other hand, seemed increasingly detached. He buried himself deeper into work and spent more time away from home, offering excuses that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. When Naomi spoke about the baby, he listened briefly, often distracted, his responses short and lacking emotion. It wasn't that he rejected the situation outright, he simply didn't engage with it. To him, this new reality felt like an obligation he hadn't chosen, something that disrupted the rhythm of the life he preferred. Instead of adapting, he withdrew further, choosing avoidance over involvement. Naomi began to feel the weight of that indifference in ways she couldn't ignore. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was quiet, consistent, and deeply unsettling. She found herself speaking less, sharing less, protecting her excitement from being met with silence. Still, she refused to let go of hope. She believed that with time, Joshua would come around, that something within him would shift once the reality of their child became undeniable. But as the distance between them grew, it became harder to hold on to that belief without question. Love, she realized, could not survive on effort from one side alone. Joshua's life had quietly split into two worlds, each carefully separated yet increasingly difficult to balance. At home, he maintained the appearance of a husband, present when necessary, composed, and distant enough to avoid deeper engagement. Outside, with Sarah, he was different, relaxed, unburdened, and fully immersed in a version of himself that required no responsibility. What started as occasional meetings had now become a routine. He spent more evenings away, more time invested in conversations and outings that had nothing to do with his marriage. Sarah, fully aware of her influence, continued to draw him in with calculated ease. She never asked questions about his responsibilities, never challenged his decisions, and never demanded more than he was willing to give. That freedom was exactly what Joshua gravitated toward. With her, there were no expectations, only enjoyment, admiration, and control. She became a constant presence, filling the emotional space Joshua had chosen to withdraw from at home. To him, it felt justified, even necessary, as though he were maintaining balance rather than creating conflict. Meanwhile, Naomi's world grew smaller and quieter. She noticed the late nights, the unexplained absences, the subtle changes in his behavior that no longer felt accidental. Though she didn't have proof, the feeling that something was wrong became impossible to ignore. Still, she chose not to confront him directly, not out of ignorance, but out of fear of what the truth might reveal. Instead, she focused on her pregnancy, holding on to the one thing in her life that still felt certain. What she didn't realize was that Joshua's double life was no longer just a phase. It was a path leading toward a decision that would soon change everything permanently. Naomi's world gradually became one of quiet endurance. Her days were no longer filled with shared moments or conversations, but with silence that stretched longer than it should. The house, once a place she tried to fill with warmth, now felt too large, too empty. As her pregnancy advanced, the physical changes became more demanding, and without support, even the simplest tasks felt heavier. She attended her medical appointments alone, sat in waiting rooms surrounded by couples, and smiled politely while carrying a loneliness she could no longer deny. Her body was changing, her emotions deepening, and yet she had no one to truly share it with. There were nights she sat by the window, holding her phone, debating whether to call Joshua, not out of desperation, but out of hope that maybe, just once, he would respond differently. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. When he did, the conversations were brief, lacking presence. He always sounded distant, as though she were interrupting something more important. Naomi never asked questions she wasn't ready to hear answers to, but the silence between his words told her enough. Still, she refused to let herself break. She spoke softly to her unborn child, finding comfort in the one connection that had not failed her. She promised strength, safety, and love, things she was determined to give, regardless of her circumstances. But beneath that strength was exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. She was carrying more than a child. She was carrying disappointment, uncertainty, and a growing realization that the life she had hoped for was no longer the one she was living. And yet, she held on, because letting go felt far more frightening than enduring. Joshua's decision to leave was not sudden. It was something he had already justified long before he mentioned it. When he told Naomi he would be traveling for a few days, his tone was casual, as though it were no different from his usual work commitments. He didn't ask how she felt about it, didn't consider her condition, and didn't hesitate. Naomi stood still as he spoke, her hands resting gently over her growing stomach, trying to process the reality of what he was saying. She was in the final stage of her pregnancy, and yet he was choosing to leave, not for work, but for something he didn't even try to fully explain. In truth, Joshua had planned the trip with Sarah. It was meant to be an escape, time away from responsibility, away from expectation, away from anything that required emotional presence. Sarah welcomed the idea without question, seeing it as another step deeper into the hold she already had over him. To Joshua, it felt like reclaiming control over his life, a break from something he no longer wanted to face. He convinced himself that Naomi would be fine, that nothing urgent would happen, that everything could wait. It was easier to believe that than to confront what he was leaving behind. Naomi didn't argue. She had reached a point where words felt useless, where trying to change his decisions only left her more drained. Instead, she nodded quietly, masking the disappointment that had become all too familiar. After he left, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. She moved slowly through the space, each step reminding her of how alone she truly was. Deep down, she sensed that something was about to happen, something she wouldn't be prepared for. The distance between them was no longer just emotional. It had become physical, real, and irreversible. And as the hours passed, that quiet feeling of unease began to grow into something far more urgent. The night it happened, everything changed in a way Naomi could never have prepared for. It began with a sharp pain, sudden, intense, and unmistakable. She froze where she stood, her breath catching as another wave followed, stronger than the first. Her hands instinctively moved to her stomach as she tried to steady herself. The realization came quickly. It was time. Fear and urgency rushed through her at once, not just from the pain, but from the overwhelming truth that she was completely alone. The house that had once felt empty now felt suffocating, too quiet, too still. With trembling hands, Naomi reached for her phone and called Joshua. It rang longer than she expected, each second stretching painfully as she struggled to stay composed. When he finally answered, his voice was distant, distracted. She spoke through the pain, her words uneven but clear. She needed help, she was in labor, she couldn't manage alone. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then his response came, cold and detached. He told her not to call him again, that he didn't care, that she should handle it herself. Before she could speak again, the line went dead. Naomi stood there in shock, her phone slipping slightly in her grip as another contraction hit harder than before. Tears blurred her vision, not just from the pain, but from the weight of what had just happened. Moments later, her phone buzzed. A message from Joshua. With shaking hands, she opened it and read the words that would stay with her forever. After delivery, your useless child, pack your stuffs and get out. The room felt like it closed in on her. The pain intensified, her strength fading with each passing moment. With no other choice, she forced herself toward the door, each step slow and unsteady. She needed help, any help. The night air hit her as she stepped outside, but before she could go far, her vision blurred, her body giving in to the overwhelming pain. And then, everything went dark. The world around Naomi faded into a blur of dim streetlights and distant sounds as her body finally gave in. She collapsed by the roadside, her breathing shallow, her strength completely drained. Time seemed uncertain, seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like nothing at all. The quiet night continued around her, indifferent to her pain, as passing cars moved by without slowing. She lay there, motionless, caught between consciousness and darkness, her body fighting to hold on for the life she carried. Then, headlights slowed. A sleek black car came to a sudden stop just a few meters ahead. Inside was Alexander Reed, a man known for his sharp mind, quiet power, and unmatched success in the business world. But beyond the wealth and influence, he carried something rare, awareness. As he stepped out of his car, his expression shifted instantly from calm focus to urgency. He had seen enough to understand the situation. Without hesitation, he rushed to Naomi's side, kneeling beside her, calling out gently to keep her conscious. Within moments, he acted. He carefully lifted her, ensuring she was supported despite her condition, and placed her in his car with precision and care. There was no delay, no uncertainty. He drove with purpose, navigating the empty roads quickly toward the nearest hospital. His focus never wavered. What had begun as an ordinary night for him had turned into something else entirely, a moment that would not only save a life, but unknowingly change the course of his own. The hospital lights were bright and unyielding as Naomi was rushed through the emergency entrance, her condition immediately drawing the attention of the medical staff. Alexander moved alongside them, issuing clear instructions, his voice calm but firm. There was no hesitation when it came to expenses. He made it clear that everything needed would be handled. Doctors and nurses worked quickly, their movements precise as they prepared for delivery. Naomi drifted in and out of consciousness, her body exhausted, but still holding on. Hours passed, filled with tension and urgency, until finally, a cry broke through the silence. It was strong, clear, and full of life. Naomi had delivered safely. The child, a healthy baby, was placed under careful observation, while Naomi was stabilized. When she finally regained full awareness, the first thing she noticed was the quiet stillness of the room, followed by the gentle reassurance of a nurse informing her that both she and her baby were safe. The weight she had been carrying, physically and emotionally, lifted just enough for her to breathe again. Alexander remained present, not intrusively, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. When Naomi learned what he had done, how he had found her, brought her to the hospital, and ensured her safety, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. Their first real conversation was simple, but meaningful. There were no expectations, no pressure, just understanding. In that moment, something new began, not rushed or forced, but grounded in respect and compassion. For Naomi, it was more than survival, it was the beginning of a second chance. While Naomi was beginning a new chapter of her life, Joshua's world was collapsing in ways he never imagined. The trip he had taken with Sarah, once filled with ease and indulgence, ended abruptly. On the return journey, his focus was scattered, his mind occupied with distractions rather than the road ahead. In a single moment, everything changed. The accident was severe, leaving no room for control or escape. What followed was a reality Joshua had never prepared for, one where power, influence, and confidence meant nothing. He survived, but not without consequence. The injuries he sustained were life-altering, leaving him physically disabled and permanently limited in ways he had always taken for granted. The independence he once valued was replaced with dependence, and the life he had built around control began to slip away. Worse still, the diagnosis confirmed something he struggled to accept: he would never regain full physical function. For someone who had always defined himself by strength and dominance, it was a loss that reached far beyond the physical. Sarah's reaction was swift and revealing. The same ease with which she had entered his life was the same way she left. There was no confrontation, no emotional closure, just absence. The person who had once represented freedom and excitement disappeared the moment circumstances changed. Joshua was left alone, surrounded not by admiration or attention, but by silence. In that silence, for the first time, he began to confront everything he had done, choices he had dismissed, words he had spoken, and the life he had abandoned without hesitation. Time passed, but for Joshua, it did not bring relief, it brought clarity. The silence that surrounded him was no longer just emptiness. It was reflection. With each passing day, memories surfaced: Naomi's quiet patience, her unwavering effort, the way she had stood by him even when he gave her nothing in return. And then, the night he chose to abandon her when she needed him most. The words he had spoken, the message he had sent, he could no longer escape them. They echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. Driven by regret, Joshua made a decision he once would have considered impossible. He reached out. It took effort, more than he expected, but eventually, he found her. When he saw Naomi again, she was no longer the same woman he had left behind. There was a calm strength in her presence, a quiet confidence that did not seek validation. She stood with dignity, no longer weighed down by the past. Joshua spoke, his voice no longer filled with control, but with something unfamiliar: remorse. He apologized, not just for one moment, but for everything. Naomi listened, not with anger, but with clarity. She did not interrupt him, nor did she rush to respond. When she finally spoke, her words were steady and certain. She acknowledged his apology, but she did not accept it as a reason to return to what had been. What he had done was not a mistake, it was a choice, one that had consequences she had already lived through. She had found strength, peace, and a new path forward, and she would not step back into a life that once broke her. Joshua stood there, understanding for the first time that some actions could not be undone, and some people, once lost, could not be reclaimed. Naomi's life no longer revolved around survival, it had grown into something steady, peaceful, and deeply fulfilling. The home she now lived in was not defined by luxury, but by warmth and intention. Every corner carried a sense of care, a reflection of the life she had rebuilt with quiet strength. Her child became the center of her world, a constant reminder that even in her lowest moment, something beautiful had emerged. She embraced motherhood fully, not with fear, but with confidence, knowing she had endured enough to face anything ahead. Alexander remained a consistent presence, never forcing his way into her life, but always there when it mattered. What began as an act of kindness gradually developed into something deeper, built on trust, respect, and understanding. He supported her without overshadowing her strength, and Naomi, in turn, allowed herself to open up again, not out of need, but by choice. Their connection was different from anything she had known before: calm, genuine, and free from pressure. It was not about replacing the past, but about creating something new, something healthy. Naomi no longer looked back with pain, but with clarity. Her journey had taken her through love, betrayal, loss, and resilience, shaping her into someone stronger than she ever imagined she could be. She had learned that love should never cost her dignity, and that walking away could sometimes be the bravest choice. As she looked toward the future, with her child beside her and a new beginning unfolding, she knew one thing for certain: this life, the one she had built from nothing but strength and hope, was finally her own. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The world of luxury often hides stories deeper than what meets the eye. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories on Luxury True Life Stories. Until our next story, take care and stay tuned for more.